Well, hello children. My name is Leslie Brett and I was born in 1931, which is 87 years ago. I was born in King's College Hospital in Camberwell in London, and I was brought up near there. Well, where I was in the kitchen, sitting at the kitchen table, and we had a little radio which we turned on September the 3rd, 1939, and the Prime Minister, Mr. Chamberlain, said he had an announcement to make, and he said they'd asked Germany not to invade Poland, but they had. So he said, "I'm sorry to say that because of this, we are now at war with Germany." This was September, and I was 7, and I would have been 8 a month later. I don't think I knew what a war involved, really, at 7. I just knew it was going to be bad news in the future. Well, the funny thing was that on the Sunday after the war started, the air raid siren went off, and people should have gone to the shelters which were already built in the street, but they didn't. They ran out of their doors and looked up. They were curious. They looked up to see if there was any aircraft coming from Germany, I suppose, but there wasn't. It was a false alarm, and the all clear went. We did have an Anderson shelter. Yeah. I got a feeling it wasn't built, the Anderson shelter, when war was declared. I think it was built during the next few weeks. They had the gas masks in boxes, and the teachers just fitted them on us. We were old enough to sort of actually wear our gas mask because it had straps on the back of it, and you fitted them over your head. Or babies they went in to a little sort of like canvas bag that they could be put in, and it could be zipped and that to stop the gas getting in. And the very little children had what became known as Mickey Mouse gas masks, because they were blue and red, and they looked a bit like Mickey Mouse. If you were about 3 or 4, you wore one of those. I think they asked your parents if they wanted you to be evacuated, because some parents didn't want their children to leave London, so they said no. But my parents thought it'd be safer if I went, so they said yes. And then they told us there would be a train at Peckham Rye Station, and we would go with some of our teachers on the train to Cornwall. Through Exeter, we went through Exeter. I know I wasn't upset at leaving home, which surprises me now because I was only 8. But no, because there were a lot of us, I think we thought it was quite exciting to go such a long way on a train. And then we were in lines, and they had houses on lists where we were to live. There were 2 rows of houses, and there were farms around, and we knew we were in the country then, because at the end of one of our row of houses there was actually a farm with cows in it. Well, we were quite interested because we were town kids, and I don't think we'd ever seen a cow up close before. There was another boy called, his surname was Dyson. He was a little blonde boy, and I was darker. The house was fairly new, but because they hadn't brought electricity and gas across the bridge from the Liskeard station. It didn't have gas or electricity. The food was good, even though there wasn't. The Cornish pasties were really absolutely delicious that she made. I was in Cornwall about 18 months altogether. I went back because the Blitz was at the end. The Blitz in London, where the bombs were dropping everywhere, was from September to December, the worst of it, in 1940. And the bombs by the middle of 1941 had eased off, the raids had eased off. So my mother decided that she'd take me back home because it was a bit safer than it had been. I stayed in London till 1943. When I took the 11 plus exam. And then I got a scholarship to Wilson's Grammar School. And as they were evacuated down into Sussex, I went on my second lot of evacuation. We were in a converted holiday camp, believe it or not, and we lived in long dormitories and had our own bed, and it had a senior end and a junior end to the dormitory. Still at school when the European War, the war with Germany ended, which was May 1945. Well, we had a big party on the night the war was declared over. Had a big bonfire and all sat round and sang and things. Well, things that have changed since 1940 was there were still more horses used. There were horses on the farms drawing ploughs still, and there were horses that pulled carts because for the baker's cart. I remember the day we went, they were building a hayrick in the field near the village, and we all went over, and there was a horse and a cart then, and they got the bales of hay, and they built this hayrick, and we all helped by carrying these stacks of hay and building a hayrick. It was a few feet high, and it was all made of hay, like a square, and then you put like a roof on it, a sloping roof, and that was called a hayrick. He was only 14 when the war started, and then when he was 16, halfway through, he joined the Merchant Navy, and he was put on a fishing trawler, and they caught fish, which was obviously needed a lot during the war because food got short again. When he was 18, he transferred to a destroyer in the Royal Navy. He was 18 in September 1917, so they probably didn't do it. It would have been the very end of 1917 or the beginning of 1918. So there was only about 10 months of the war left when he went in the Royal Navy. It wasn't frightening. There weren't really any aircraft in the First World War, so when they were on the sea, they were safe. They just crossed the channel, and that was the only time he ever went abroad, wandering on the docks in Boulogne in France. He was in the boiler room, yeah. He shoveled, he was what's known in the Navy as a stoker. Because you stoke the fires, you shovel coal. My dad was 40 when the Second World War started, so he was too old. He didn't get, but some of the dads, one or two of the dads that were a bit younger, say about 37 or 38, that had just got in at the end of the First World War, they went in again. They weren't called, they volunteered to go in because they were still in their 30s. When I was a very small boy, there was no electricity in the house. There was gas, but no electricity. So the lighting, when I was 2 or 3, was from gas lamps. And you turned on the gas and lit a sort of thing. It was called a mantle, and it glowed, and that's how you got your light. And then in about 1937, 1938, that's before the war, they laid the electricity in the street, and in the houses you had electric light. But you didn't have any electric points, no sockets at first. Well, if you did your ironing, you took the bulb out of the electric light and plugged in the iron, and then you ironed on the table. People began to have electric sockets before the war, that they could plug the radio in. That was a great improvement, because before that you had to get a battery to make your radio work. That involved getting going round the corner usually to the shoe repair shop and getting a bottle full of acid with electrodes in it, which made a battery, an accumulator it was called, and that ran your radio. The only heat in houses then was from the coal fire. Well, the coalmen came round the streets, and everybody had a coal bunker in the house somewhere where you put it. The coalman tipped a couple of bags of coal in. It was cold, very cold, until you lit the fire. Every morning you had to light a fire with sticks and paper, and when the sticks caught fire, you gradually put bits of coal on till they started to glow, and you had a proper coal fire. It was really cold in bedrooms. In the winter, if you took a glass of water, in the height of winter, it would be ice on top in the morning. Well, how you washed yourself was you had a bowl in the sink, and you either washed yourself in cold water or you heated up a kettle on the gas stove and had hot water. Well, we had a bath, but it wasn't in the house. It was a tin bath, and it hung outside the back of the house. You had to bring in the tin bath into the house, put it near the fire, and then fill it up with hot water. In the kitchens, there was a thing in the early days called a copper, which was like a stone bath where you heated up water and put it in there, and then you put the clothes in and stirred them with a large stick or something like that. And there were no washing machines, but there was shops in amongst the shops called the bag wash, where you could take a bag of washing down, and it went to a laundry and then came back, and you collected it. It had been washed. Well, the first thing is that hardly anybody had a car. In the streets where I lived, I think only one person out of maybe 100 houses had a car before the war, because people just couldn't afford them. Somebody who worked with my father at the laundry had a car, and 5 of us, him and his wife and my dad and mum and me, we went by car to Ramsgate, to the seaside. That was the first time I'd ever been in a car. It was a very little black Austin car. They were famous. Buses were quick. Where you got on was open. You could step into the bus, not through a door, just onto the platform at the back. No, there was 2 people on each bus. There was a conductor with a bag over his shoulder on a strap, and he had a ticket machine, and you gave him your money and he gave you a ticket which he punched a hole in with his ticket machine, and he gave it to you, so you had a ticket. Well, from where we were at Camberwell, because there were no cars on the roads, the buses were quick. They they could get from Camberwell Town Hall to Piccadilly Circus in 20 minutes because there was no cars to get in their way. Hardly any, anyhow. There were trams as well. Well, they ran on rails down the middle of the road. And it shows how little traffic there was. A few cars. You had to walk from the pavement across the road to get on the tram which was in the middle of the road. The first memory, a really clear memory of a tube station was the Elephant and Castle tube station. Because of the bombs, people were sleeping down on the platform in the tube station. And when I came back from Cornwall in 1941, when we got off the tube at the Elephant Castle, we come from Paddington to the Elephant Castle on the tube, we had to step over people who were sleeping on the tube. That's the first clear memory I've got of people, actually, old ladies in night dresses who were getting ready to go to sleep on mattresses on the edge of the platform. The food was mainly different because there were no supermarkets at this time. They hadn't been invented. And mothers didn't work if they had children. So they went round the greengrocers and the butchers and bought meat and vegetables that morning, came home and cooked them in the oven. So you had homemade food. There were no ready meals that you just popped in the oven. That everything was cooked from scratch that you bought that morning. It was all proper food. Yeah, there were cereals, there were cornflakes and shredded wheats even then during the war. Oh, well, there was toast, of course, as well. But I've never been a big breakfast eater, so I often just had tea and a bowl of cornflakes. Almost when you stopped feeding from being fed as a baby, you went on to small cups of tea. Of course, you could have our orange juice as well. The kids drank lots of hot milk and lots of cold milk. Lunchtime, I came home from school, being so near, only 4 doors away, and my mother would have cooked a lunch. Might be steak and kidney pie, and potatoes, and carrots. We called the 12:30 meal dinner, and part of that meal would be would be allowed to go cold and cooked again when father came in from work, say 6 o'clock. It would be heated up. In the evening, well, that was a fairly small meal, but you know, then you could have a sandwich, or well, there was always cheese, of course, and there was also tins. Even then, there were tins of corned beef and things like that. There was lots of jam. There were no Indian restaurants. No Italian restaurants. There might be one or two in Soho in the middle of London. Food in the cafe was English food, which meant egg and bacon and that for breakfast, which you can still get, and then meat pies and roast beef and Yorkshire pudding and English dishes. It was English food in the cafes and English food you made. No pizza. That only in Italy, none in England. You got to remember that Italy, where the pizzas come from, we were fighting in the war. They were our enemy, so there was no chance of getting anything coming from Italy. It wasn't till long after the war. The first foreign Italian food I remember was spaghetti bolognese, coming in the 1950s. Yes, we were issued with ration books pretty quickly after the war started. I would say it was beginning of 1940. They were sort of brown books with coupons for different foods, like butter and meat and things like that. There was a shortage of meat because obviously meat couldn't be bought on ships anymore because, you know, the ships had to be used for other things. So there was meat that was grown in the country in England, but it was in short supply, so the meat ration was very small. A little card for sweets, a sweet ration card that had that you could tear off little bits of it and hand over for sweets if there were any sweets. There were no sweets in the shops during the war, except on very rare occasions. Once, I suppose this would be about 1942, there was a story that there was chocolate bars in the local newsagent cum sweet shop, and we all the kids got their ration cards and ran round and queued outside the shop. I should say there were about 100 children. And then the lady came out with a cardboard box, about 6 inches square, and when she opened it up, there were 24 bars of Cadbury's milk chocolate. So the first 24 kids in the queue got a bar of chocolate with their ration cards, and everybody else went home with no sweet. I saw them being handed out because I was near the shop door, but I didn't get a bar. Well, when she came out with a small box, I counted the people that were ahead of me inside the shop, and I thought, I'm just going to miss out. So I got no chocolate. There was a blackboard, and you each had a bit of chalk and a slate you could write words on and things like that. And there was also pencils and paper, of course. There was a big blackboard at the end of the room, and she wrote up the words in chalk. I liked school from the first, yeah. I think we cut up paper with sticky on the other, you know, that was plain one side, and coloured paper to plain, and we made things, you know, and we stuck them on and made things like lanterns and things like that. There was even a maypole for Empire Day. That was like a pole that they put in the middle of the playground that had sort of like straps round it, and people dance, what's called dance around the maypole. You know, you revolve round, hanging onto these straps. When I was a kid, a small child, it wasn't considered bad to smack or cane children. It was a normal thing. It was taken that children were naughty, and if they were naughty, they needed smacking or caning with a little bamboo-type cane. When I was at the grammar school, there was lots of caning, and even the senior boys could cane the junior boys. It hurt, yeah, because they caned you on your backside. I don't remember anybody being caned at primary school. There were less. You were stood in the corner, your back to the class, because you'd been badly behaved. Each day, that's difficult to remember all these years over. I think we started about 9 and went on till 4 with a midday break of an hour. Yeah, there were playtimes. They rang a bell in those days, you know, a hand bell, and you had 10-minute break in the middle of the morning. and 10-minute break in the afternoon. Well, when I was in the infants before the war, there wasn't a midday school meal. People went home and had a meal. But during the war, they brought in school meals because they were afraid that, because rationing there was a shortage of food, that all children had to have one good meal a day, which was made at school. And there was a free bottle of milk everybody got, which didn't vanish till Mrs. Thatcher stopped it in the 1980s. Well, the toilets weren't a lot different to they are now, except that because there was no plastic, the seats were wooden, and the cisterns that the water flowed out of were made of iron and painted, to stop them rusting. We had an inside toilet, but the flat downstairs had an outside toilet, which was very cold in the winter. They were the same as the indoor toilet, really, except that there was a wooden door to the outside toilet, that you obviously closed behind you when you went to the outdoor toilet, and there was a gap underneath, gap top and bottom over the door sort of thing. There was no television, and at first there was no radio, but there was, after the electric came, there was a radio that people listened to. But people played games a lot. People sat and played cards. My pal had a chemistry set, and we made all sorts of things with that. We even made a sort of wine, which was really coloured water, really. Yeah, people played in the streets. They played on these wooden scooters, and but there were all games that were famous outdoor games, which was there was one called Knocking Down Ginger, where you knocked on people's doors and ran away and hid and watched them come to their door and find there was nobody there, which was thought to be great fun. And of course you had a wicket. You made a wicket with coats in the summer, and there were small cricket bats for the small ones and larger ones, and people just bowled and people fielded. Oh, and there was lots of rounders. Oh yeah, there was a game called Shove Halfpenny where you there was a polished board of wood with lines across it, and you had to knock these pennies, or halfpennies you could do as well, up the board with the heel of your hand to get in between the lines on the board. Yeah, Shove Halfpenny, that was played a lot. Yes, during the war there were famous radio programmes. The most famous was Itmar, which was short for It's That Man Again, with Tommy Handley. That was absolutely, everybody listened to it during the war. And it had a series of characters, including spies, including a German spy called Fumpf. And there were lots of jokes. Well, of course, there wasn't any television, so people entertained themselves. All the children had to be able to sing a song or recite a poem. And people literally stood around a piano and sang. It was people were a lot more entertaining in themselves. They didn't just sit in front of a box and watch other people doing it. They actually sang the songs and recited and played musical instruments themselves. Because nearly every house, even poor houses, had a piano then. Well, people read comics, of course. There were lots of children's comics in those days. Well, there was a thing before the war, when we were little, it was called the Tuppenny Rush. And for 2 pennies, that's less than 1p, you could go to the cinema and see cowboy films. There was lots of cowboy films, lots of Indians, lots of things like that that amused children. Cowboys that were famous, like Tom Mix, and later Roy Rogers, much later. Some were serious cowboys that fought, and some sang, rode horses and sang and things like that. No, this was all in black and white. Yeah, you didn't see the Disney cartoons till after the war in the middle 40s sort of thing. Well, they were just funny. They were 10 minutes and funny, you know. There was Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck and iPads? No. At work, I used to read a magazine called The New Scientist, and this used to report on new developments in science. And the first computer firm I remember reading about was IBM, International Business Machines. And they built machines that were large for offices, and they were about taller than a man and about, 3 or 4 feet wide, with lots and lots of wiring at the back. Computers are small now because everything has been miniaturized, made small. But then all the valves and things were large. I would probably turn 40 before I actually saw a computer. There were lots of lead soldiers and lead ships, and later lead planes that you could fly on with a string of cotton, or because they had a little hoop on the top you could thread through, and you could make them fly down the room sort of thing. Whole boxes full of like a regiment of soldiers, some marching with rifles, some playing musical instruments, some riding horses. And later you could get them with, when they were riding in little cars that were around during the war, like they were called jeeps. I had the sort of skittle things, a board that you pulled a rope and the skittles stood up, and then you had a ball on a chain, on a pole at the other end, and you swung it and knocked down the skittles. One of the main playground activities was skipping. Skipping ropes were very big with young girls. Everybody skipped, and there were loads of songs that were sung to skipping. Skipping was a very big pastime for girls. Oh yeah, there were dolls. Yeah, lots of different dolls. Big and small, ones that spoke when you tipped them up, ones that opened and closed their eyes. And people made toys then. Lots of things were made in those days. Scooters were made from wood, and ball bearings on axles back and front, and there were races down the street, because that's one of the advantages of no cars, was that children played in the middle of the road. They were different, but mostly it was a different time, and no boys went into long trousers. No boys ever wore long trousers until they were about 14. That was a sign that you were nearly ready to go to work. Before that, you wore short trousers right up until, with your knees showing, until you were about 13 or 14. Teenagers didn't wear different clothes. But when you reached 15 or 16, you wore a smaller version of what your father wore, which would be a suit. You'd go and get measured for a suit. There was nothing like t-shirts or, special things for teenagers. There weren't, jeans. People didn't wear jeans. They hadn't been invented then. No, Jesus had been born about 2,000 years before, and so he wasn't alive. Well, men and women look roughly the same as they do now. They haven't changed a lot, but the jobs have changed. The engine drivers were the heroes to everybody then, because they drove these great steam engines, with a fireman beside them who shoveled the coal into the engine to make steam. And of course big farm would have 100 people working for it. Because when you had a great big field of corn or wheat then, it was chopped by men, dozens of men with scythes, cutting it by hand, swinging a sharp scythe. Whereas now that work's done by 2 or 3 people on tractors. And of course, there were hundreds of typists. When I first went to work in 1948, must have been 60 women in the typist pool alone typing. During the war, he became a milkman for the co-op. He pushed a cart loaded with milk, yeah. Well, the milkman had glass milk bottles, which he carried in a small sort of tray with a handle, and he delivered milk at everybody's door. People found it more convenient to have it on the doorstep, because if you were out of milk in the morning, there it was, fresh on the doorstep. That was another reason it was delivered every day, because nobody had refrigerators then. They were different in that there were very few cars. Hardly anybody had a car before or during the war. So that people walked a long way. Even as 7 or 8 when I went to Cornwall, people would go on a 5, sometimes a 10-mile walk. Even when they were, 6, 7, 8, they would walk miles, and we walked a mile to school when I was 8, a mile and a half to school, and in the morning, and a mile and a half back. There was no getting on a bus. There were lots more owner-occupied shops. The person who ran the shop lived above it, sort of thing. There was nothing called a buggy, but there were push chairs for children when they got 2 or 3. But before that, prams were very large. They had 4 big wheels, and they were called baby carriages, and they were large. But they don't have them much these days. Well, hardly ever see one. They were high off the ground because they had big wheels. And then you went into what was called not a buggy but a push chair, where you were strapped in. We were able to make a gate in our back fence and do something which we were strictly not allowed to do before the war, which was go onto the railway embankment, and you could actually grow things like tomatoes and runner beans and carrots, and that was very useful because food was... There was a slogan then called "Dig for Victory," and everybody was encouraged to grow their own food. And we did raise a couple of chickens in a little shed on the embankment too. We ate the chickens, yeah. We raised them and we ate them. We grew potatoes, carrots, runner beans, and tomato plants. It was very like it is now. It was 6 or 7 weeks of the long summer holiday. Well, people didn't go abroad because there were no planes taking people abroad before the war. You could go by ship, but you had to be fairly rich to do that. So people went all round England and Scotland, and they went on the train or the coach, which was called the Charabanc. We went mostly to Ramsgate. Were big fun fairs in those days, large enclosed places, you know, with loads of roundabouts and slot machines and things like that. And they sold things, you know, like rocks, and the beaches were absolutely packed on fine days. Well, they swam and built sandcastles at Ramsgate and played games. Yeah, there were donkeys on the sand. Yeah, there would be about 6 or 8 in a row, and you paid maybe a penny and got on a donkey, so 6 children would go along on donkeys up the sand and then turned round and came back. Punch and Judy they were dressed like clowns, Punch and Judy, you know, with funny hats and striped clothes, and Punch had a truncheon, that's a sort of stick, and when people annoyed him, he used to beat them over the head with the stick. And there were other things that appeared, like a crocodile, which used to get hit over the head too. Well, everybody laughed, yeah. They knew what was coming, but they laughed just the same. There were ice cream parlours up on the top of the beach, you know, and they were run by Italian families because they were expert in making soft ice cream, which had a really creamy flavour. So you got your ice cream, they had a big tub of ice cream and they put it on top of the cornet. There was candy floss that they put the sugar in the machines and they whirled the sugar around and sort of floss came out, and they put it on the end of a stick and you wandered off eating that. Because when the Germans invaded countries, they could steal art from out of the art galleries, and the generals, Hermann Göring in particular, who was head of the German Air Force, it gave them a chance to make collections of very valuable paintings, which would have cost tens of thousands of pounds before the war and millions after the war. They just took them back to Germany and built art galleries so that they had great big collections of art. In the war, the pictures from the National Gallery in London were hidden in caves in Wales in order to make them difficult to steal if the Germans got here, which fortunately they didn't.